Wichita Liberty TV, featuring host Bob Weeks. Local politics without the spin. Interviews with nationally respected economists. Hear directly from Kansas conservatives about what matters to you. It's individual liberty, limited government, and free markets. Wichita Liberty TV.
Hello, I'm Bob Weeks for Wichita Liberty TV, your weekly source for news, analysis, and commentary about Wichita and Kansas government and public affairs. Broadcast on Great Plains Television, Channel 26.1, also its companion website, kgpt26.com. Some of you may know me for my blog, The Voice for Liberty. That's on the internet at wichitaliberty.org. There the motto is individual liberty, limited government, free markets, and economic freedom in Kansas and Wichita. If you'd like to learn more about the issues covered today or to contact me, visit wichitaliberty.org. You can subscribe to the email newsletter, like The Voice for Liberty on Facebook, or follow me, Bob Weeks, on Twitter. This week on Wichita Liberty TV, David Bobb is president of the Bill of Rights Institute. Prior to that, he was executive director of citizen education for Hillsdale College and also a lecturer in politics there. He is the founding director of two centers for Hillsdale, the Allen P. Kirby Jr. Center for Constitutional Studies and Citizenship and the Hoagland Center for Teacher Excellence. He is also the author of the book Humility, an unlikely biography of America's greatest virtue. Of this book, Paul Ryan, now Speaker of the House of Representatives, wrote, "Humility is essential to good character and to our country." In this smart and lively book, David Bobb illustrates this virtue with the stories of 5 great Americans and reminds us that humility is at the core of our national creed of equality and liberty. David earned his Ph.D. in political science from Boston College. Now, David Bobb of Bill of Rights Institute. David Bobb, welcome to Wichita Liberty TV. As president of the Bill of Rights Institute, headquartered in Arlington, Virginia, could you give us an overview of what the Bill of Rights Institute does?
The Bill of Rights Institute engages young people with the ideas of liberty, with the ideas of opportunity, and we make the argument to students, primarily those at the high school level, but also middle school students, that the Constitution and America's founding is something worth their attention. Mm-hmm. That these things that happened so many years ago, so many centuries, in fact, are as relevant today as ever. And we work with a nationwide network of about 1 in 4 of America's educators in the area of civics, government, history, and economics.
And I think I've heard one of your presentations in Wichita already, but you talk about source documents as opposed to the filtered view that maybe in history textbooks we see today or something like that. So source documents, that's like the Constitution itself. Is that right?
Yes, we think it's important that when you're going back and trying to understand history, that you take a look at those primary source documents. For one, they're a lot more interesting than the boring text in a textbook. You know, so many textbooks just approach history as one thing after another. You memorize those dates and names, they all kind of blur together. And it's no wonder that so many of our students come away without an appreciation of history in these courses. Mm-hmm. When you take a look at those primary source documents, you pick up a letter, say, written from James Madison to Thomas Jefferson, or from John to Abigail Adams, or something that's much more recent. Say, pair it up with a headline ripped from yesterday's website of choice. Mm-hmm. What you see is that those questions that they were grappling with back in the day are some of the same ones that we're wrestling with today.
And you told about an edition of the Constitution that was published very recently, and it had a disclaimer that I really found quite astonishing.
Yeah, the disclaimer is astonishing, but it's sadly emblematic, I think, of a lot of the ways that we approach the teaching of the Constitution. The disclaimer said something like, warning, kind of like a trigger warning in one of today's university classrooms. The document you're about to read was framed at a time when people held very different values, and they may not be the same ones that we have today. Mm-hmm. So parents should use caution before and read it and consider it before introducing it to their children. And that's in some ways the way that we've approached the Constitution as a whole today. You know, it was good for back in the day for the powdered wig, tri-cornered hat wearing set. you kind of hear echoes of fife and drum music, right? But for today, we have a very different appreciation and a very different set of values. And what we argue at the Bill of Rights Institute is not that we have to be backward looking, but rather that you can learn something from a deep appreciation of those truths that are enduring in the Constitution. And it's worth introducing young people to those ideas.
Oh, very good. I know one of the things you're talking about here in Wichita, and like you said, the mission of the Bill of Rights Institute is civic education. Now, I think of, remember when Jay Leno was host of The Tonight Show, we'd do the jaywalking segment. He'd like maybe hold up a picture of the vice president and say, who is this? And people would not, very often not be able to know that. And I think John Stossel does things like that too. So is that what we mean by civic education? Just maybe knowing who your state senators are and how many justices are on the Supreme Court? Or does it go beyond that you're concerned about?
It really goes beyond that. You know, I think that it's good for people to know those things and to be plugged into what's happening on the political scene. But today people are given very little reason to think that that's the discourse that's really important, right? It seems kind of like a big giant food fight, verbal food fight. And what we really mean by civic understanding and civic education is civic engagement, that young people would have the knowledge, but also be willing to defend those ideas that are really important, that they'd be able to make those kind of connections that I was talking about between old ideas but new applications, and that ultimately they would have the wherewithal, the civic virtue, to be able to stand and find their voice. You know, that's what young people are trying to do, to figure out, what does it mean to be a good citizen? What does it mean to be a good human being? Those are really important questions. And in order for those questions to be answered, you have to put it in practice in real life. So it's a lot more than just book learning, though that's a component of it. But it's so much more than those boring old charts about separation of powers. Because the thing that gets really interesting about civics are those why questions, those things where there's real controversy, real push and pull. And so those are the kind of questions that we take up.
Yeah. I know I was, in preparation for this, I looked at what do Kansas high school students have to learn these days. And there is a requirement for a year-long course in the United States government, including the Constitution. And here we're in Kansas. They're proud that 85% of students graduate from high school. So I'm thinking, should be no problem. All these high school kids should know about civics, but I have a feeling that's not necessarily the case, is it?
It's not. You know, there's a lot of mandates. They come from Washington, D.C. They come from Topeka. They come from a whole host of impositions on teachers. And oftentimes what's lost in the middle of that is real learning, the things that students are going to take with them for a lifetime. So just because there's mandates doesn't mean that real engagement, real learning is happening. There's a lot of other things that are at work for the kind of engagement that's really important.
Okay. Well, David, hold on to that idea for a moment, because we're going to take a moment off for a commercial break. This is Wichita Liberty TV, and I'm Bob Weeks. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks, and with me this week, David Bobb, president of the Bill of Rights Institute. David, when I attended the University of Kansas, and this is getting to be almost 40 years ago, we had a year-long course in Western civilization. You know, we read from the ancients to the modern things. We even read Capitalism and Freedom by Milton Friedman, although I didn't really understand it at that time. Is that type of course still common in universities today?
No, it's really not. You know, I think what has been a real sea change is a shift away from that kind of a required course, especially in Western civilization. You know, there was not that long ago, but I guess now in the 1980s, the chant, hey, hey, ho, ho, Western Civ has got to go. And that was at Stanford University. And
Stanford, okay.
Not long after that, I think you really saw the kind of hollowing out, we might say, of the core. That there would be a core curriculum. So the fad much more now is to have kind of cafeteria style, students get to choose whatever they want. And very often professors will put out whatever hobby horse research activity that they're doing, and students lose those kind of deep dives or trips through kind of a lot of a survey course. Those just aren't taught quite as much as they have been in the past.
Interesting. Yeah, back then it was even the engineering majors and stuff still had to take those type of classes. But talking about colleges, there's a lot of controversy about speech on campus and so forth, and also perhaps a left-leaning bias in many professors. I debated this week. I was invited to debate a political science professor from, I'll leave it an unnamed university right to the west of us here, or east of us. But he said that Kansas may run out of money, Wichita may run out of money, but the federal government will never run out of money to pay Social Security benefits because we control our currency, we can make as much of it as we want. Is something like that part of a civics education, or is that too much of an economics type of topic, do you think?
No, I think really what a well-formed kind of civics education would encompass is very much an economic way of thinking. So, for example, in a textbook that we published at the Bill of Rights Institute called Documents of Freedom, it's available free of charge to any user. We have about 13,000 registered users across the country that are teachers. And they take these this course that was done with a full-fledged textbook, and it really blends 6 units of civics and 2 of economics. And so I think it's a really important and vital, neglected part of our education, because there's so many people that are financially illiterate. They don't have a sense of history either, and the two so often go together, because we need to answer questions, looking back at, say, the Great Depression. What got us out of the Great Depression? Was it in fact government intervention? Many textbooks argue just that. But I think what we see is that economics education is one of those really neglected areas.
And I think that's really important today, because we have one of the candidates in a major political party who knows, maybe the nominee, calls himself openly a socialist, and young people seem to be embracing that label. And I'm wondering, don't high schools and colleges teach what happened when there were actual socialist governments? It hasn't been that long ago.
Well, sometimes they do. I think that more typical is like a campus I was on at a private school in the state of Florida, where they had a definition of communism posted on the library wall, and it was communism where everyone shall share alike, all equal. And so very often you're lucky if in a course, even an AP US history course, that students are getting to much beyond World War II. It doesn't mean that that's always the case, of course, but very few of our textbooks treat the Cold War in a rigorous, careful way, where students are really going to come to an understanding of what Karl Marx taught, of what Lenin and Stalin acted on, and what the Soviet Union and the entire communist bloc stood for. And so they have no sense of that. I'll give you one quick story about this. I was at a conference where they brought together a bunch of kids, high school and college age, across the political spectrum. One young man had a shirt of Che Guevara on. And another fellow, his same age, came up to him and said, "You know what, that shirt stands for something, because I'm of Chinese descent. I lost my grandparents in one of the famines and purges of Mao. And so what Che stood for means something to me." And that the young man who was wearing that shirt had to pause and say, "I had no idea."
Yeah, it seems they get caught up in fads, but yeah, when you look at what some of these figures actually did, I mean, how many people did Stalin, Mao, Hitler, and so forth exterminate? And it's mind-boggling, and have to realize that at least my parents lived through that, and almost had to do that or go through that too. A book that you have titled Humility, an Unlikely Biography of America's Greatest Virtue. Humility sometimes seems to be another old-fashioned concept and virtue. Could you explain what those two things are, and why are they important, maybe not only in politics, but just in general life?
Yes, I think that humility is a neglected virtue. Oliver Wendell Holmes said humility is the first virtue for other people. It's always good if you can find it in other people, but it's really hard to practice yourself. And what got me thinking about this is how often politicians spout off on humility. When they get elected, they say, "I'm humbled, I'm honored." But then very rarely do you see that put into practice. But yet it's something that so many people kind of vaguely sense as an important quality in a leader. not to mention an important quality in people that you want to be around. And so it is an oft neglected virtue. And lately it's come to be associated with a kind of weakness. You know, if you're humble, the idea goes you're kind of wimpy, you might be a wallflower, you're a pushover. And I think it means just the opposite, in fact, that if you're humble, you actually have internalized a certain strength, an ability to look at your own failings, own up to them, and try to do better, but recognizing that you're not going to be perfect.
Yeah, and we all have failings. I know Charles Koch, in some of his recent media appearances, he's been talking about humility, and he tells stories about how, I think it was in the 70s, Koch Industries tried to branch out into the big oil tankers, and they almost lost everything they had. And I think some of those things show even a very successful person like Charles Koch can make almost career-ending or company-ending mistakes. David, hold on to those thoughts because I want to explore that a little bit more. This is Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks. Welcome back to Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bob Weeks, and with me this week, David Bobb, president of the Bill of Rights Institute. So, we were talking about humility. Is that something that's compatible with being a politician? I mean, you want to convince voters to vote for you, and that seems to be, well, at least some people, like I'm going to say Donald Trump, means to bragging and beating down of your opponents. So that doesn't seem to be very humble to me, is it?
No, I think that's right. And Donald Trump was recently at a church. This was before the Iowa primary. The pastor's sermon was on how to be humble and humility. And Trump came out and he said, people don't realize how humble I am. So he fell right into a kind of trap, right, which is to brag about your humility. And I think that it is consistent. It's possible, but it's rare. Think of what Abraham Lincoln did once. He had instructed a certain type of strategy to U.S. Grant, and the general went in a different direction and actually succeeded in what he was endeavoring to do. The president wrote him a letter, and he said a very simple sentence, a couple of sentences: "I was wrong, you were right." Think of how rarely that happens in history.
Yeah, you don't see that a whole lot. I was going to say that I imagine an important aspect of humility is always telling the truth. Right now, there's a lot of controversy in the presidential race, but it seems like there's a difference between telling the truth and having made or I would say lying to people versus having made a mistake. And that seems something that we don't distinguish between too much anymore.
Yeah, it's very hard, though, and I think, notice how oftentimes there'll be a apology for a mistake in Washington.
If I offended anybody.
Yes, if I offended, but there's also then mistakes were made, so that you're not just owning up to it. So if a mistake is made, own it and move on, because I think you're right that, humility starts with a certain honesty and introspection that says that you know yourself well enough to know your failings. Mm-hmm. So there's an intellectual component which says that I could be wrong, and I'm willing to be proven wrong. Mm-hmm. When was the last time that somebody said, I held position A, now I hold position B because you know what? I realized that I was wrong to hold that first position. And I think voters might, for instance, be a little bit more forgiving of that. They would say, well, that's not wishy-washiness. That's just recognizing you made a mistake. But when it's always about nuancing and finessing and admitting nothing of real change, that just seems implausible. It is, ultimately.
Yeah, it would be refreshing, I think, to see candidates say, yes, I used to believe that, then I got smart or whatever and took the beliefs I have now. That I think many people have gone through transformations like that in their lives. But they just want to say, no, I didn't really mean that or something like that. In a speech of yours about this book, you said humility requires that we admit when we were wrong and then change course. It's the sole state of self-knowledge in which we put others ahead of ourselves in thought, word, and deed, despite our tendency towards self-aggrandizement. So does that kind of sum up, the things that we've been talking about, do you think?
Yes. I think that it's so natural, and this is the problem. Benjamin Franklin wrestled with this a lot. He was a 20-something, very high on his own capabilities. Of course, he had immense capabilities. But what he was prone to do is cut people off, ridicule them if they were wrong. And he started an effort that he later looked back on in life and credited it with a lot of his success. And this thing was, I'm going to choose 12 areas of my life, Ben Franklin said, that I need to improve on. And he gave that list. It included things like order and just being more frugal, things like that you could improve in your own life. And he gave this list of virtues that he was going to work on to a friend of his. The friend said to him, Ben, you ought to add humility. And he did. And he said, I then realized that I shouldn't cut people off in conversation, that I shouldn't always try to win the argument at all costs, kind of going for the jugular. And he said that helped him over the next 50 years of his life to so often and more often carry the actual debate, because he wanted to win people over rather than just win the argument.
Yeah, rather than, and we see that all the time, especially on social media like Facebook. I mean, people they just want to be proven right, and it doesn't really matter whether people respect them or anything like that after all. Is humility related to altruism in any way, or are they distinct concepts? I mean, I'm thinking that like Ayn Rand, for example, was, she was against altruism. I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I hadn't thought of a connection necessarily. I think that if you're humble, you're likely going to be grateful. Those two things seem to be related in a certain way, and I think that's a very important and often neglected virtue as well, and really a disposition, right? I mean, there's so much about which we have as Americans to be grateful, and yet you see, and social media perhaps exacerbates this, just the litany of complaints, and so there's a way in which they might be related. I haven't thought about it though.
I know in Wichita we struggle. Myself and some of our fellow activists were always seen to be against so much. Sometimes we try to find issues that we're in favor of, so that people won't always call us the naysayers and the cavemen, citizens against virtually everything. That's what they call some of us. So that's a problem there. David, we're about to run out of time. How can people learn more about the Bill of Rights Institute? You have a website, and it sounds like many of the documents we've talked about are available there. Is that right?
Yes, you can go to billofrightsinstitute.org.
Okay.
We're also on Twitter and Facebook, but all of our resources, whether the textbook that I mentioned, Documents of Freedom, lesson plans for teachers, for those who are who have kids or grandkids that you're interested in getting involved in ideas. We have a lot of programs, including a scholarship contest, summer programs that are held in the Washington, D.C. area, and then programs held all around the country for individuals who are interested in learning more about this.
And there is kind of a vigorous homeschooling community here in South Central Kansas. Are these materials suitable for that also?
Absolutely, and they're all free of charge to the end user. So we're delighted, work with homeschoolers across the country, and love to see just the way in which that's flourishing. I think there's now about 2 million across the country. It's a great movement.
Well, very good. Well, David, Bobb, it's been a pleasure. Thanks so much for being on Wichita Liberty TV. Well, that's all for this week, so we'll be back next week with another episode of Wichita Liberty TV. I'm Bobb Weeks.